Friends, if you are excited to watch the upcoming blockbuster Brick 2025 in English, then you have come to the right place. If you are visiting our channel for the first time, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any updates. In today's video, we are going to talk about Brick 2025, a film that has already created a buzz even before its release. We will discuss what this movie is all about, where you can watch it, and all the interesting details that make it worth waiting for. I am going to share with you the information about which OTT platform or satellite channel will bring this movie to the audience. We will dive into details about the making of the film, including the technical side, the music department, pre-production, filming, post-production, budget, and even the expected box office collection. Along with that, we will explore the storyline of Brick 2025, and I will give you a quick review of what makes its story stand out from the rest. We will also look closely at the star cast, the roles played by each actor, their performances, and how well they fit into the characters. Plus, we will uncover some fascinating facts about this movie that you might not have heard anywhere else. That's why I recommend you stay with me till the very end of this video because there is so much to talk about. So, let's begin today's video and dive into the world of Brick 2025. Brick 2025 unspools its story like a carefully layered puzzle, refusing to hand the audience a straightforward map while still keeping you glued to the tension. The film begins in medias res, dropping viewers into the locked, almost claustrophobic environment of the building without much exposition, which immediately signals that survival and observation will be more central than spectacle. Early on, small details, blinking lights, cryptic messages on monitors, ration logs, seem incidental but slowly accrue meaning, turning the environment itself into a character that observes, judges, and occasionally betrays. The narrative doesn't strictly adhere to conventional linear progression. Instead, it experiments with time and perspective, weaving flashbacks, overheard rumors, and monitor footage into the present timeline, so what you think you know can shift from scene to scene. Key turning points revolve less around physical action and more around information. Who discovers the pattern in the blinking code, which rumor circulates unchecked, and the timing of small betrayals or alliances dramatically alters the stakes. Conflicts are both internal and social. Characters wrestle with fear, morality, and trust, while the external threat of resource scarcity and surveillance keeps tension taut. Emotional beats are earned in quiet, almost microscopic moments, a glance, a trembling hand, a whispered apology, that resonate more powerfully than shouted confrontations. The narrative thrives on the uncertainty of knowledge. What the audience sees is often filtered through incomplete or biased perspectives, so every revelation invites you to reassess relationships and motives. Small routines, like tallying days or marking doors, are elevated into symbolic acts that carry narrative weight, and the suspense often arises from who knows what, rather than what physically happens next. The rhythm of the story alternates between slow, tension-filled observation and sudden bursts of moral or practical reckoning, making viewers lean forward and rethink the environment and characters' decisions constantly. By the time the film reaches its climax, the audience has internalized the stakes not through explosions or chase sequences, but through the accumulation of choices, secrets, and small ethical compromises, which makes the unfolding feel both inevitable and shocking. In essence, Brick 2025 crafts a narrative that rewards attentiveness and emotional investment, using time, perspective, and the microdynamics of its confined world to build suspense and engagement in a way that is intellectually and viscerally satisfying. The characters in Brick 2025 arrive looking familiar: an ordinary couple, a handful of neighbors, a few loud personalities. But the film delights in quietly unpeeling those surfaces until everyone looks both recognizable and strange. The central couple begin as opposites on paper, one pragmatic, one emotionally generous, and the pressure of the sealed building forces them to trade roles, with the pragmatic partner learning to take emotional risks and the generous one sharpening into a strategist who can lie when necessary. Their arguments about rationing and escape double as confessionals, and those small domestic fights reveal private histories, losses, quiet resentments, the kind of practical kindness that becomes a leadership skill under duress. Secondary figures are where the movie gets most interesting. The true believer, downstairs, starts as comic relief with conspiracy-laced sermons but slowly hardens into a tragic emblem of ideology. His faith that the wall is protective becomes a philosophy that justifies cruelty, and his arc shows how certainty can calcify into violence. The would-be escape artist is intoxicating at first, charismatic, quick with tools and plans, but hubris is written into his decisions and his fall becomes the film's moral fulcrum, a cautionary counterpoint to the couple's slow, stubborn humility. There's also the silent watcher, the neighbor with old monitors and an uncomfortable set of secrets, whose technical savvy and withheld information turn him into a reluctant catalyzer. His transformation is less a heroic reveal than a shame-tinged growth, from bystander to someone who must own the consequences of silence. Relationships in Brick never stay static. Alliances form and unravel on a sentence. Trust is currency, and gossip functions like a plot device. A rumor about a back stair will rewire loyalties the way a true confession does. Motivations are mercifully human: survival, protection of loved ones, the need to make meaning when everything external has been stripped away. So choices feel consequential not because the stakes are abstract but because the characters' inner lives are on the line. The film uses tiny gestures to layer depth: a stolen half bottle of water that later becomes a symbol of penance, a lullaby hummed in the dark that shifts a character from brittle to tender, an apology offered in the middle of a crisis that changes a group's plan. Growth is rarely clean. The most sympathetic characters commit ugly mistakes and then adapt, learning to negotiate, to tell the right lie at the right time, to decide when to hold someone and when to let them go, and those compromises make them richer and less heroic in the classical sense. Conflicts are often interpersonal rather than monster versus human: jealousy over scarce resources, ideological splits that fracture tactical coherence, and the slow erosion of civility as fear accumulates. The screenplay treats these fractures as plot propulsion, so character decisions, not sudden revelations, drive the narrative forward. The emotional payoff is subtle. Instead of grand speeches, the film rewards small reversals: a stubborn neighbor lending a tool, a character choosing to stay with someone rather than rush to freedom, that tell you who they've become. Even the antagonistic figures are shaded. The true believer's conviction includes a terrified childlike hope, and the escape artist's bravado hides a desperation to prove worth, which makes their downfalls mournful rather than purely punitive. By the time the final crisis forces a last, terrible choice, the characters are recognizably different. Less certain, more weathered, often morally compromised but paradoxically more empathetic because surviving together required understanding one another's brokenness. The movie refuses tidy transformations. Instead it gives you believable, sometimes uncomfortable evolution. People who gain skills and lose innocence, who wind up making survival choices that stain them and yet reveal the truest parts of themselves. The performances in Brick 2025 do the heavy lifting, as if the script handed actors a locked room and asked them to pry human truth out of the cracks, and most of them answer with tiny, devastating choices. The two leads carry the film the way a pair of hands carry a fragile object. One actor plays restraint like an economy of movement, shoulders hunched, voice low and careful, making every rationing argument feel like a negotiation with a guilty conscience. The other plays emotional intelligence as if it were a tool: quick smiles that don't reach the eyes, sudden tenderness that snaps into steel when plans go sideways. So their chemistry is a live wire, sparking off domestic trivia and horror with the same believable rhythm. In quieter beats you see their growth. The pragmatic partner's jaw relaxes in a stolen lullaby scene, and the generous partner's eyes harden when a plan requires lying. Those micro-shifts sell character evolution without a single melodramatic line. The escape artist bursts in on the screen with a kind of cocky physicality that suggests both competence and desperation. His hands are always busy, fiddling, measuring, proving he can solve things other people can't, and when hubris collapses into consequence the performance flips from bravado to hollow panic so quickly it feels like watching someone lose their own self-image in real time. The true believer downstairs is a marvel of tonal control. At first he's comic and theatrical, delivering conspiracy riffs that make you smirk, then a single late sermon peels back the mask into a twitching, terrified core. His voice breaks between conviction and pleading, and suddenly his fanaticism reads as grief. The silent watcher with the monitors is the kind of supporting turn that owns a frame without speaking. The actor uses the smallest physical tells: a blink, the way he lingers on a feed, a sudden flinch when caught, to telegraph decades of guilt, and when he finally speaks the restraint makes the confession land like a fist. Ensemble moments are where the casting truly scores. In group scenes the performers trade domination and submission like currency, gossip turning tactical, apologies becoming bargaining chips, and those shifting dynamics feel improvised yet inevitable because everybody commits to detail. Someone chews the edge of a ration packet as if it were a cigarette, someone else hums to drown out the panic. Tiny choices that create a lived-in ecology of fear. Vocally, the film is fascinating. Whispering becomes a weapon, raised voices are code, and sudden silences, held by actors who can make the camera feel like an accomplice, are louder than any scream. Physicality matters in a film about confined space, and the cast uses it. A hallway shove, an exhausted slump against a brick, the way an actor moves through a hole in the ceiling all tell backstory better than exposition. There are standout beats that elevate the material: a confrontation where two neighbors trade accusations and the camera stays tight enough to catch a single, betrayed blink, a moment when the lead folds a crumpled photo and the actor's hands tremble so subtly you feel the history without hearing it explained, and the escape attempt where the charismatic plan collapses and the actor's fallout is a howl half swallowed into pragmatism. Even smaller roles are shaded, an annoyed tenant who becomes a sacrificial miscalculation, a medic who's trained calm phrase into frantic improvisation, and those shifts make the stakes feel earned. The director's choice to favor long takes gives performances room to breathe, and the actors exploit that generosity. Improvisatory-sounding overlaps, awkward laughter that doesn't quite land, and real-time decisions that read as life, not a script. Importantly, the cast makes morally messy decisions believable. When someone chooses to hoard or to betray, the performances give you access to motive. Fear, shame, survival, so you can hate the choice and still understand the person. In short, the acting turns claustrophobia into character study. Faces become maps, silences become sentences, and the film's emotional truth rides not on big speeches but on the steady, often uncomfortable honesty these performers bring to small, human moments. The director treats the sealed building not just as a set piece but as the film's loudest collaborator, shaping tone and mood with a kind of minimalist bravado. Camera choices make the walls feel sentient, lighting turns ordinary hallways into mood swings, and sound design turns silence into an active force that presses on the actors. Rather than showy flourishes, the film's style lives in controlled textures, a preference for long takes that let performances simmer, sudden whip pans that convert a domestic spat into an oncoming threat, and tight framings that turn doorways and stairwells into emotional choke points, so the audience learns to read space the way characters do. Pacing is a study in pressure, slow, patient stretches where rationing and argument map character, punctured by short, brutal bursts of panic that rewrite the room's social order. The director uses this ebb and surge to make the film feel like breathing under a weight, and the rhythm itself becomes a storytelling device. Shot composition loves layers, foreground objects, an upturned bowl, a child's drawing, a dangling cord, act as silent witnesses and can be foreground or shoved out of focus to hide or reveal clues, while careful depth-of-field choices let a background argument fester within a single frame. The interplay between static wide frames that show group dynamics and intimate close-ups that catch micro-expressions is deliberate. When the camera holds long on a face, you start to count breaths and tiny lies, and when it backs off you see how people perform survival for audiences made of neighbors. Stylistically, the director delights in visual motifs, the recurring brick texture, the stubborn geometry of blocked doorways, the way light fractures through a peephole, which work like a secret language. Repeated objects and sounds gain meaning as the plot moves, turning mise-en-scene into a code the audience learns to read. There's also a tactile quality to the filmmaking. Practical effects, dusty light shafts, and the physicality of actors moving through tight spaces remind you that the world is made of touch, not CGI, which keeps danger feeling immediate and bodily. Sound editing is not an afterthought but a sculptor of suspense. Mechanical hums, distant radios, footsteps that might be real or imagined, so scenes depend as much on what you hear, or don't, as what you see. The director exploits diegetic noise to mislead, comfort, or isolate characters on a moment's notice. The film's visual palette shifts to mirror mental states, muted, suffocating tones during denial and ration scenes, colder, sharper contrasts when paranoia takes over, so color timing functions like an emotional metronome. Blocking and choreography in group scenes are quietly brilliant. People rotate through frames like players in a social experiment, alliances forming and dissolving in choreography that reads as both organic and staged, which makes the film feel lived and yet highly controlled. Finally, the director uses reveal and misdirection as ethical puzzles. Information is doled out in glints, flickering monitors, a half-heard confession, a framed photo in the wrong place. So revelation is often a moral choice rather than a plot trick. The way the camera chooses to reveal or withhold becomes an accomplice to characters' decisions. And that choice makes the movie less about solving a mystery and more about watching people decide what to do with the truth. Cinematography in Brick 2025 feels like a hand on your shoulder that won't stop guiding you. It's constantly deciding whether to whisper or shove, and those choices shape how every cramped corridor and fractured ceiling reads on screen. The film loves to play with scale. Wide lenses make hallways stretch into absurd, almost theatrical tunnels where a single footstep can feel like an explosion, while tight, short-focus close-ups flatten faces into maps of strain so you can read every microtwitch and swallowed syllable. Camera placement is rarely neutral. Low angles give the brickwork an oppressive, monumental personality. Overheads turn the ensemble into a moving diagram of suspicion, and off-kilter framings or slight Dutch tilts creep in when a plan goes wrong, visually tilting your equilibrium before anything actually happens. Movement is choreographed to mood. Long, unbroken tracking shots let conversations breathe and let tension accumulate naturally, while sudden handheld bursts fling you into panic during a chase or a failed escape, the frame jittering like a pulse. Framing is used as a language. Doorways and stair rails create bars and frames within frames so that even a full-room shot reads like a portrait of containment. Foreground objects are deliberately employed to occlude faces or eyes, turning familiar faces into half-seen mysteries and making the camera complicit in withholding information. Lighting works like a character too. Practicals, flickering bulbs, a single flashlight, a TV glow, are the film's emotional thermostat, moving from the warm, human amber of brief calm to the sterile, blue-green harshness of panic. Chiaroscuro moments carve actors out of the dark. A half-lit face becomes a confession, a silhouette becomes a threat, and shafts of dusty, tangible light make small domestic items look cinematic and uncanny at once. Color timing is subtle but telling. Muted, desaturated palettes dominate the survival beats so objects and people sink into the same visual breath. Then occasional pops of saturated color, a red toy, a bright poster, sting the eye as reminders of life beyond the bricks. The cinematographer uses depth of field not just to focus attention but to betray it. Soft backgrounds keep secrets foreshadowed, and sudden, razor-sharp depths reveal patterns the audience almost misses. There are moments of visual bravura that stick, a slow, puckish pan through a room as a rumor spreads and faces register it one by one, an extended shot through a peephole that compresses space and makes the world outside look both impossibly distant and intimately observed, an elevator shaft sequence shot from below where light slices like a blade and gravity seems to swallow sound. Texture is fetishized, close-ups of brick grain, scuffed shoes, condensation on a kettle, so you feel the set as much as you see it. Reflections and monitors get used as unreliable mirrors, letting the camera multiply viewpoints and make the act of watching itself feel suspect. Optically, the film mixes wide, sometimes slightly breathing anamorphic frames for group dynamics with intimate, almost claustrophobic lenses for private moments, so the visual grammar can switch from documentary immediacy to staged fable in a breath. Composition often breaks tidy conventions. Characters are left in negative space, half-cut by frames, or deliberately centered in symmetries that make the viewer uncomfortable, because the camera wants you to register imbalance before a line of dialogue tells you why. All of this adds up to a cinematography that treats claustrophobia as an aesthetic choice. It makes the confined feel large, the mundane feel threatening, and the occasional beautiful patient shot act like a tiny, cruel consolation. Editing in Brick 2025 works like a hidden metronome. Sometimes it breathes so slowly you can hear the characters settle into their nerves, and then it snaps into tiny, staccato bursts that feel like someone riffling the pages of the screenplay to find the next panic. The editor clearly trusts long takes for the human stuff, meals being divided, arguments unraveling, those tiny conversational pauses where a lie is born, because letting a scene play out without a cut gives the actors room to make choices that feel lived in rather than performed. Those unbroken moments are the film's emotional anchor. But when the building's rules change, the cuts do too. Escape attempts and frantic searches are edited with a propulsive, almost percussive rhythm. Close-ups of hands, quick insert shots of tools, a tight cut back to a face that sells the cost of every misstep, so the pace becomes a machine that accelerates with stakes. Transitions are playful and purposeful. J-cuts and L-cuts blur audio across cuts so a line begun in one room finishes over a new frame, which keeps the world contiguous even as the geography fragments. Match cuts and visual motifs, a brick, a flicker, a blinking monitor, are used to stitch scenes together thematically, so the edit itself starts to feel like a code the audience learns to read. The middle of the film leans on montage to compress routine, rationing, water runs, repair attempts, so time passes without losing intimacy, but those montages are laced with tiny reversals, a cut that pauses on the wrong face, a split-second insert that reframes a rumor, that make you reevaluate what you just saw. Spatial editing is smart. The cut pattern often simulates claustrophobia by chopping perspective. Snap from a wide that shows the group to a disorienting close that isolates one person, or intercut ceilings, hallways, and monitors to make the building feel like a living, watchful organism rather than a backdrop. There are deliberate moments of disjunction, jump cuts and slight continuity breaks that read as psychological tilts, not mistakes, so when a character begins to fracture the viewer experiences it physically, a small cinematic trick that turns temporal instability into empathy. Rhythm is used as a weapon. The editor stretches breathless silences until they ache, then punctures them with a fast cut that lands like a shock. Conversely, after a violent burst the film often returns to a near-silent, slow cadence that forces you to live with the consequences. Sound bridges and diegetic loops are often the glue between cuts, and editing choices that keep a hum or a radio signal running across a montage let the score of the world carry emotional information, even when picture cuts away from a face. The film occasionally risks sagging in its patience-heavy stretches. Some scenes hold longer than casual attention might allow, but those lulls are intentional setup for tonal whiplash, and when a sudden quick-cut sequence arrives it feels earned rather than gratuitous. Pacing across the whole film is like a breathing exercise, measured and steady during exposition, accelerating through the midsection as plots and paranoia intersect, and then tightening into rapid, sometimes disorienting edits as the climax forces simultaneous actions to collide. The edit then relaxes into a slower, contemplative tale that leaves image and sound to linger and unsettle. Crucially, the editing amplifies performance. Timing a cut to the exact micro-expression or to the subtle change in a voice makes choices feel consequential, and group dynamics are sharpened by how the editor chooses to linger on one person's reaction while cutting away from another's rationale. The overall effect is an editing strategy that treats tempo as storytelling. Every cut is a decision about who gets to hold the truth for a beat longer, who is revealed and who is misled, and that editorial deliberation keeps the audience not just watching events but feeling the film's moral and emotional arithmetic. The soundtrack of Brick 2025 operates less like background decoration and more like an active roommate. It breathes with the building, marks moments, and occasionally argues with the scene. At its core, the score favors economy over grand gestures. Long, low drones and sparse, percussive ticks create a steady under-pressure feel so that silence becomes a dramatic tool rather than a void. Recurring motifs do the heavy lifting. A terse three-note figure that first appears as a barely audible pulse in the opening sequences becomes a running cipher, showing up in different textures, an electronic blink on a monitor, a muted piano echo in a hallway, a distant brass smear in crisis. So the music itself helps the audience decode patterns before the characters do. Character themes are subtle and fragmentary rather than neat little tunes. The couple share a fragile two-note interval that is often doubled in intimate scenes and then stretched thin or inverted during arguments. The true believer's presence is suggested by a droning, chant-like undercurrent that feels religious without being melodramatic. The silent watcher gets jittery, static-laced motifs that mimic broken transmission. What's smart about the sound design is how score and diegetic sound blur. A radio fragment will be musically processed and folded into the orchestra, making you question whether a cue is part of the soundtrack or just someone's old TV. That ambiguity is a storytelling device. Sometimes the music deliberately masquerades as an in-world noise, a hum that could be an air conditioner or a bass synth. So revelation scenes arrive with a cognitive double-take where audio and image conspire to mislead or reveal. The composer leans heavily on texture, bowed metal, filtered synth pads, processed field recordings of brick and mortar struck gently to create percussive elements. So much of the score feels tactile. You don't just hear the walls, you sense their grain. Rhythm is used narratively. Sequences of blips and pulses mirror the visual patterning, blinking lights, monitor flickers, and become a code the audience learns to recognize, which tightens tension because the music sometimes signals incoming danger before any character notices. Silence is treated as an instrument. Cuts to near-total quiet amplify Foley, a single creak, a spoon on a tin plate, and make micro-sounds unbearably loud. Then the score re-enters with a minimal sonic motif that reframes what you just heard. The film's quieter cues are emotionally precise. Small melodic fragments underscore regret or tender confessions without swelling into sentimentality. The score rarely tells you how to feel, it colors what's already there. At moments of panic, the composer lets percussive editing take over. Staccato hits, clipped string slashes, and electronic glitches chop to match the film's frantic cutting so that music and editing form a single, breathless mechanism. There are standout set pieces where composition and sound design converge, an extended sequence where a discovered monitor plays back static that gradually resolves into a harmonic interval, or the late-stage attempt to replicate a blinking code where the soundtrack isolates the pattern into a musical phrase, turning a technical clue into an almost operatic moment. Mixing choices matter. The score sits low during dialogue-heavy scenes to allow vocal nuance to come through, then rises into the foreground during solitary or hallucinatory moments, which makes the music feel like an emotional spotlight rather than an overbearing narrator. Thematically, the score mirrors the film's moral ambiguity. Motifs are never fully resolved. They're altered, abridged, or corrupted as characters make compromises, so musical callbacks feel like memory fragments rather than tidy reprises. Finally, the soundtrack's restraint is its bravest move. By often withholding a traditional leitmotif payoff and choosing texture and pattern over melody, it keeps you off balance in much the same way the plot does. Leaning close when you expect a comfort and pulling away just when you want release. So the music doesn't just accompany the claustrophobia, it invents new ways for you to feel it. Brick 2025 sneaks up on you as a genre puzzle and then quietly pulls out a philosophy exam. Its themes aren't shouted as slogans but threaded through the smallest survival choices, so you leave thinking about walls long after you forget the plot points. At the obvious level, the film is obsessed with safety versus control. The The bricks are a literal technology meant to protect, but they become a cage, which asks a very 21st century question. When our inventions stop being tools and start being regimes, who decides which rules count? That gets folded into a second sneakier theme about internal architecture. Characters build private barricades of shame, certainty, and fear that mimic the physical masonry around them, so the movie keeps nudging you to see the real prison as psychological. Information and narrative operate as currency. Gossip, monitors, and half-seen footage aren't background noise but weapons and maps. The film makes the act of telling a story feel tactical. What you decide to believe or repeat changes plans, reallocates resources, and can literally cost a life, so the theme becomes as much about narrative power as it is about bricks and mortar. Surveillance and complicity move together like breath and heartbeat. The watcher with the feeds is both the film's conscience and its moral rub. Silence and secrecy are shown to be choices with measurable consequences, and the camera often punishes the spectator for choosing ignorance. Social contract and trust are examined under pressure. Rationing scenes and arguments turn civic norms into fragile experiments, revealing that cooperation is not an automatic response but an active practice that can be eroded by scarcity, ideology, or the thirst for control. Moral ambiguity is a recurring mood. The film rejects easy heroes, preferring characters who compromise, justify, and survive in ways that stain them. Those messy decisions are the point, because they force you to ask what you would do when comfort and conscience are on opposite plates. Community and small mercy become counter-themes. Tiny gestures, sharing water, humming a lullaby, lending a tool, are treated as political acts, subtle rebellions against isolation that feel more heroic than any dramatic escape. There's also a running critique of technological hubris. The defensive tech that traps people is less a villain than a mirror. Our urge to engineer safety without reckoning with human unpredictability turns protection into punishment. Symbolism is economical but rich. Bricks, monitors, blinking lights and repeated musical pulses all double as motifs of control, memory, and the way patterns seduce us into false mastery. Finally, the film reads as an allegory for contemporary anxieties, about gated lives, algorithmic governance, rumor-driven panic, and the fragility of trust, but it resists sermonizing by dramatizing those anxieties in lived, often painfully small moments. The emotional payoff isn't a tidy moral. It's the lingering discomfort that maybe the most dangerous thing is not the wall outside but the way we stack our own pieces inside, brick by private brick. Brick 2025 treats visual effects like a quiet collaborator rather than a flashy curtain. Most of the film's visceral power comes from handcrafted, tactile effects on set, and the CGI is used as a careful assistant to sell the impossible without calling attention to itself. Close-ups live in the practical world. Real, weighty bricks, scuffed floors, dust motes, practical lighting rigs and functioning monitors give actors something physical to push against, so hands, faces and fabrics react to genuine textures. Those in-camera moments are what make the film feel touchable. Digital work shows up where physics or scale would be impractical. City-scale extensions that turn a rooftop into a horizon of the same black carapace, subtle matte paintings that continue hallway geometry beyond the stage walls, and invisible touch-ups that remove rigs or stitch set pieces together. The smartest VFX choices are hybrid. A blinking code reveal, for example, often starts with LEDs or a flickering practical screen on set and is then digitally augmented, tracked, color-matched and rhythmically emphasized, so the effect reads as both diegetic and compositional rather than a post-production ornament. Compositing prioritizes photographic integrity. Camera tracking, plate matching and careful light probes keep shadows and reflections honest. Depth of field and motion blur are preserved so CG bricks don't float against real actors, and particle sims for dust or crumbling plaster are layered subtly to sell collisions. Practical effects win the intimacy battles. An upturned floorboard, a leaking kettle, a splintered banister feel indisputably real, while CGI wins the scale ones. Collapsing geometry, distant skyline extensions, and a couple of shots where the building's outer skin peels or ripples are handled digitally with convincing material shading and displacement work. There are moments where digital repetition shows. The wider establishing shots occasionally reveal pattern tiling when the camera lingers, but those lapses are used sparingly and the filmmakers often hide seams with low light, smoke, or quick edits, which keeps the audience suspended. Textural detail is prioritized in compositing. Grime, specular highlights, and tiny surface imperfections are layered back onto CG elements so they catch practical light like real masonry. Reflections on metal or wet surfaces are matched to on-set sources to avoid the typical CG cleanliness problem. The effects team also leans on analog tricks, projection mapping, practical rig removal, and in-camera flicker, to reduce reliance on heavy-handed CGI and to preserve performance-driven reactions. Set extension shots make good use of photographic plates and projection reference so actors can move convincingly through spaces that will only be completed later, and the rotoscoping is tight enough that jitter or haloing is rare. In sequences of structural failure, the mix of practical debris, actor choreography, and layered digital dust and particle work creates a physical claustrophobia. You feel the bite of falling plaster and the choke of dust because the foreground was often real while the background was enhanced. Overall, the visual effects strategy reads conservative and pragmatic. Use real things where actors touch them, use digital where reality can't go, and spend the bulk of craft time on matching light, grain and motion so nothing announces itself as added later. The set design in Brick 2025 reads like a character dossier written in dust and peeling paint. Everywhere you look there's a tiny biographical note that tells you who lived there before the crisis and who they've become under it, and that relentless attention to lived-in detail is what makes the world feel honest rather than staged. Hallways are dressed like memories. Scuffed skirting boards, mismatched doorbells, a tapestry of flyers and taped-up notices that suggest decades of neighborhood life, so even before a line of dialogue you know this building has a history and that history will matter. Individual apartments where personality and props. One door opens onto a cramped kitchen with a kettle permanently on the stove and jars labeled in a careful hand, another reveals a wall of framed certificates and a single child's crayon drawing taped askew. Those contrasts are production design shorthand for socio-economic difference, private grief and daily rituals, and they're used to tell stories without exposition. The sets are tactile, real bricks with chipped mortar, plaster dust that floats under a flashlight, exposed wiring that snaps under tension. Practical elements that actors can touch, shove, and recoil from, which makes reactions feel grounded and gives VFX a solid anchor to blend into. Designers use repetition as a language. The brick texture appears in wallpaper patterns, in a child's block toy, in a rusted grate, so motifs echo across the production and keep the eye busy looking for meaning. Spatial choices sharpen drama. Narrow stairwells become choke points for confrontation, long windowless corridors force characters into side-by-side mise-en scenes that read as both intimacy and accusation, and the basement is dressed like a different climate entirely. Damp concrete, sickly fluorescent tubes, and the clutter of someone who has been saving everything in case of a storm. So each location carries a mood and a set of implied rules. Small prop work is a quiet masterstroke. Tally marks scored into door frames, carefully labeled ration tins, a misfiled passport or a dried-out phone battery in a drawer. These objects function as narrative beats you can trip over and pick up again later. The production design also smartly choreographs visibility and concealment. Bulletin boards, half-open cupboards, and stacked boxes serve as natural hiding places for clues and secrets, and monitors or mirrors are placed to create double views. What characters see and what the audience sees are frequently at odds because the set literally allows for multiple perspectives. Locations outside the core building are used sparingly but effectively. The rooftop, a fire escape landing, a cityscape glimpse through an ironically small peephole, so the contrast between cramped interiors and the hint of a wider world becomes an emotional lever rather than an expositional tool. Color and texture choices are deliberate. A palette of tired neutrals and industrial grays is punctured by personal splashes, a bright scarf, a child's toy, a faded poster, that register like reminders of life beyond the siege and make those moments of tenderness visually pop. Practical set details also enable clever blocking and camera moves. The way a ceiling beam or a stair rail bisects a frame helps the director stage betrayals and reconciliations as physical maneuvers. A doorway becomes a moral threshold rather than just an entry point. The design team also thinks about sound implicitly. Materials chosen for their acoustic properties, wood that creaks, concrete that echoes, intensify footsteps and muffled shouts so the building itself seems to speak. Even the choices that feel small are narratively loaded. A kitchen table with carved initials becomes a ledger of promises, a busted TV that still flickers offers false consolation, and a tool set left on a windowsill transforms into both salvation and temptation depending on who picks it up. In short, locations and set dressing aren't window dressing here. They're active collaborators in plot and character work, supplying clues, shaping movement, and turning ordinary objects into symbolic currency that the cast, camera, and audience all read in real time. Dialogue in Brick 2025 reads like an instruction manual for panic. Precise where it needs to be, messy where people are allowed to be messy, and often slyly funny in the way real people are funny when they are terrified. The script prefers lines that do work beyond information transfer. They reveal backstory, shift alliances, and act as traps that characters can step into or avoid. Right away the writing trusts the audience with subtext. A casual line about saving the kettle for guests becomes a thesis on dignity and class once water runs low, and small repeats, an offhand nickname, a phrase about counting blinks, A joke that comes back in a meltdown. Turn dialogue into leitmotif so conversations accumulate meaning like bricks stacking into a wall. The naturalism is earned. People interrupt, they finish each other's sentences, they lie by omission, and the script allows for those clumsy, human beats rather than polishing every exchange into cleverness. As a result, sarcasm, tenderness and cruelty live next to each other in one breath, and actors can play the space between words rather than relying on speech to carry everything. Humor is a relief valve and a character reveal. The escape artist's bravado is often a punchline that later curdles when his plans fail, and the true believer's jokes about the wall shift tone as conviction hardens, so lines that once read as comic become tragic in hindsight. The screenplay uses economy, few wasted lines, so when someone utters one of the rarer, longer monologues it lands as truth or a confession, and those moments feel earned because the default is short, tactical speech. Information is dramatized as commodity. Gossip, an overheard radio fragment, or a clipped technician's explanation isn't just exposition, it's a tactical move that characters trade, hide, or weaponize. The writing makes the act of telling a story itself dramatic, and this turns ordinary dialogue into a chess game where a seemingly casual remark can change who eats that night. Subtext is an art form here. The script loves to let objects talk through lines. A character holding a crumpled photo will say less about it than 100 expository sentences, and uses mundane lines. Did you lock it? No. To drum up paranoia because the pauses and looks around the room carry more freight than the words. Distinct voices matter. The couple have complementary cadences, one clipped, practical, sentence fragments, the other wrapping phrases in empathy and rhetorical questions. The escape artist speaks in measurement and action verbs, the true believer in declarative, sermon-like rhythms, and the watcher's lines are spare, technical, always a beat late. This vocal diversity lets the script create texture without hitting any verbal homogeneity traps. There's an offbeat lyricism at times, short, blunt metaphors that double as philosophy, so the screenplay can be both sharp and quietly poetic without tipping into melodrama. Lines that equate a brick's weight with a promise or a ledger of missed birthdays pop up and linger, and the film uses them to charge ordinary speech with symbolic resonance. The dialogue choreography in group scenes is a highlight. Overlapping talk is edited to create pulses of gossip and accusation, so scenes feel like a social experiment where volume and direction of speech become a leader's currency. The way the editor lets a line trail into silence or cuts immediately to someone else's denial does half the argumentative work that would otherwise need a speech. There are memorable, definitional lines, short, repeatable beats that the film returns to at key reversals, such as, "We didn't build walls to keep the world out, we built them to keep ourselves in, count the blinks, patterns keep secrets, and you don't hoard things, you hoard reasons." These invented examples function like axioms in the film's moral economy and stick because they bundle character, theme, and plot into 3 or 4 words. The script isn't afraid of silence. In fact, it treats pauses as punctuation, letting a dropped line hang until the camera or another character answers, which makes the absence of speech feel like an audible decision. Stylistically, the writing plays with registers. One moment street-level banter, the next a near-technical explanation of a blinking code, so tonal shifts are earned by context rather than dropped for effect. Occasional bluntness in exposition is smoothed by character stakes. When someone explains an engineering detail, it comes out as a nervous, breathless attempt to be useful, not as a dry explainer, and that keeps technical speech human. Finally, the script's bravest move is moral ambiguity via language. Characters make persuasive, ruthless arguments that feel logically sound in the moment, and the dialogue forces you to hear those rationales without endorsing them. Lines are designed to make you empathize just enough to be unsettled by what survival asks of us, so the writing leaves residue. Phrases that keep replaying in your head and making you reevaluate who was right, who was cruel, and who simply wanted to live. Brick 2025 treats genre like a toolbox it's allowed to rearrange on the fly. It wears the locked room thriller skeleton, an enclosed building, dwindling supplies, a plan that must be hatched and then unhatched, but it constantly tweaks the tools so the familiar doesn't feel lazy. The film borrows survival horror's claustrophobia, sci-fi's technological anxieties, and the social realism drama of neighbors pushed to their limits, then stitches them together with an emphasis on rumor, narrative as power, and the everyday mechanics of living under pressure, which turns genre expectations into dramatic levers rather than checklist items. It follows conventions where they work, the tense escalation of a bottle episode, the archetypal roles, the planner, the believer, the showman, because those beats reliably generate stakes, but it subverts payoff by refusing tidy catharsis. The charismatic escape artist's fall isn't a cheap comeuppance but a cautionary unmasking. The fanatic's rhetoric isn't mere villainy but a portrait of how conviction mutates under scarcity, and the supposed outside reveal scrambles the usual escape to safety trope into something morally ambiguous. Freshness arrives in the movie's obsession with information as currency. Blinking codes, monitor feeds, and gossip function as weapons and plot drivers, so the film feels less like a puzzle to solve for spectacle and more like a social experiment where storytelling itself is tactical. That idea gives the movie a distinctive spine that separates it from other siege narratives. Where Brick leans on clichés, gritty stairwell confrontations, a sacrificial last stand, a panicked breakout attempt, it often undercuts them with human detail or tonal inversion. Jokes that start as relief become barbed, domestic routines become claustrophobic rituals, and familiar set pieces are staged to reveal character compromises rather than to deliver pure adrenaline. The balance between action and suspense skews towards slow burn tension. The film builds pressure with long, patient scenes of bargaining and boredom, punctuated by sharp, violent bursts that land harder because the audience has been living in the lull. When action does arrive, it's dirty, immediate, and consequence-heavy rather than spectacle-driven, which keeps emotional cost attached to physical moves. Humor is needle-sharp and survival-marked. Wry asides, bitter jokes and ill-timed levity humanize people without undercutting danger, so the film's laughs act as social glue and character revelation rather than comic relief padding. Drama lives in the small chemistry of relationships. Ration table arguments, half-confessions, and the economy of apologies carry more narrative weight than any set piece, which makes the movie feel less like genre fan service and more like an interrogation of how stories are used to govern groups. Stylistically, it blends conventions too. Long takes and restrained camera work from arthouse traditions sit side by side with genre editing and sound cues, so the film can feel intimate and mechanical at once, a hybrid that uses technique to question the very rules of its type. The result is a film that will satisfy fans who like the claustrophobic puzzle aspect while irritating purists who want tidy resolutions. It both embraces and mocks genre expectations, mining familiar tropes for moral complexity and stretching them into surprising places, so what could have been a by-the-numbers siege thriller becomes a small, stubborn experiment in how societies fracture, bargain, and occasionally, awkwardly, try to keep one another human. Brick 2025 uses its locked room setup as a microscope for contemporary anxieties, surveillance, technocratic control, rumor economies, and the brittle architecture of trust, so the film's politics feel lived in rather than lectured. The watcher with his monitors, the blinking code motifs, and the building as technology operate as literal and symbolic devices. On the surface, they dramatize how defensive systems meant to protect can calcify into regimes, and underneath they map how information and narrative have become everyday weapons. Who whispers what, who records, who repeats a fragment of radiostatic determines who eats, who moves, who survives. Social inequality is quietly sketched into the production design and daily routines. The places people come from and the things they keep in their drawers matter when resources run thin, so cultural commentary arrives through objects and habits rather than blunt speeches. Ideology and faith are handled with texture. The true believer isn't a cartoon villain but a character whose certainty shields a frightened interior, which lets the film explore how grief and fear can harden into conviction without excusing the harm that conviction does. Gender and domestic labor show up as political stakes too. Small routines and unpaid care work become strategic assets or liabilities under scarcity, and the couple's shifting roles illuminate how crisis redistributes power in both tender and ugly ways. Importantly, the movie treats rumor and storytelling as civic currency. Gossip, monitor feeds, and half-heard transmissions function like currency and ordnance, so the film makes a political point by dramatizing choices about what to tell and when to keep silent. On the rare occasions the screenplay leans into expositional tech-speak, it risks sounding didactic, but more often themes are embedded in mise-en-scene, micro-behaviors, and the moral arithmetic of small acts, sharing water, hiding a photo, tallying days, so commentary emerges organically from what characters do, not what they preach. Handling of sensitive topics skews empathetic without excuse. The film gives space to motives and trauma, showing how complicity and survival blur moral lines, yet it still holds actions accountable by dramatizing consequences. Culturally, it resonates as a parable for our era of algorithmic governance and pandemic-tinged isolation. The story doesn't need to name those parallels to sting, because it focuses on the human scalars of those systems. Rather than sermonize, Brick 2025 stages moral experiments. It forces viewers into the arithmetic of living together under engineered conditions, making the political consequences of private decisions feel immediate and uncomfortably personal. Brick 2025 is the kind of film that tugs at your attention like a persistent neighbor, sometimes annoying, often unnerving, and impossible to ignore, so audience engagement feels less like passive absorption and more like being roped into a moral experiment. Laughter arrives in brittle, guilty bursts, a badly timed joke about rationing, a character's arrogant one-liner that collapses into silence. And those tiny laughs work as emotional pressure valves that make the next panic hit harder. Tears are earned in small private moments rather than big melodramatic beats, a crumpled photo passed between hands, a lullaby hummed in the dark, a quiet apology traded over a shared sip of water, and because the film builds intimacy through long takes and micro-expressions, those weepable beats feel like discoveries rather than manipulations. Excitement is tactical. It spikes during the escape attempts and technical decrypting scenes where rhythm, sound and editing lock together and you suddenly care about the geometry of a stairwell. Shock lands when plans collapse in an instant, when a charismatic figure falls because of hubris, or when the outside world reframes the siege and forces you to reassess everything you thought the film promised. Engagement is amplified by the film's play with information. Because clues are visual, oral and verbal, viewers feel clever when they catch a blinking pattern or recognize a musical motif, which makes repeat viewings genuinely rewarding. You'll rewatch to spot the blink pattern you missed, to map the recurring brick imagery, or to listen for the subtle audio cue that turns a rumor into fact. The movie also invites argument. Was that hoarding a sin or survival? Did the watcher betray or tell the truth? Those ambiguous moral beats make perfect water cooler debate fodder and give the film longer shelf life in conversation than a pure spectacle would. Structurally, the film keeps attention by alternating boredom with stakes, rationing, petty squabbles, with short, visceral shocks, so the lull makes the spikes feel earned rather than manipulative, that rhythm makes viewers lean forward rather than check their phones, and when the picture rewards attention with puzzle fragments, the sense of investment grows. Socially, Brick's focus on rumor, surveillance and narrative as currency primes audiences to share theories. Who is lying, who has the real maps, what the blinking means, so it's the sort of film that breeds conspiracies and think pieces in equal measure. Emotionally, the cast's commitment to microbeats means viewers hang on tiny gestures, a hand that trembles, a glance that lasts, which makes empathy granular and often uncomfortable. People cheer survival, but they also squirm at the compromises that survival demands, and that mixed feeling is what keeps the film resonant. Finally, the sensory detail, sound design that makes silence loud, motifs that repeat like mental tics, and set pieces that reward close looking, turns watching into an active exercise in pattern recognition. Audiences who enjoy puzzles and moral gray zones will find themselves rewatching, arguing, and replaying key scenes long after the credits, because the film hands you a code and dares you to untangle its human cost. Brick 2025 slots comfortably on the same shelf as locked room thrillers but keeps pulling readers out of the box by mixing familiar genre mechanics with unexpected priorities. Unlike the pure puzzle box logic of films that treat enclosure as an abstract maze, Brick treats confinement as a social lab where gossip, technical know-how, and petty domestic rituals become the real plot devices. Think of older siege pieces where the set is the spectacle. Brick shares DNA with those films but flips the emphasis from "how do we get out" to "who owns the story about how we might get out," which makes it feel less like a mechanical thriller and more like a micro-society study. Compared with claustrophobic single-location movies that drive tension through physical impossibility, Brick spreads suspense across moral choices and information economies. Where one film might stage a nail-biting physical escape, Brick makes the discovery of a blinking pattern or the timing of a rumor itself the dramatic currency. If you line it next to political allegories or social satires, it has a kinship with works that use confined settings to explore inequality and trust, but Brick prefers understatement over moral spectacle. Its social critique is embedded in props, ration logs, and the way neighbors barter stories rather than in big expository beats. Technically, it borrows tricks from both arthouse and genre, long takes, texture-rich practical sets, and tactile sound design, so viewers who like formal filmmaking will recognize the craft, while fans of pure thriller mechanics will find the action sequences leaner and costlier in emotional terms. For audiences expecting franchise potential, Brick teases rather than panders. The late reframing of the outside hints at a larger world, so the film can exist as a self-contained parable or the seed of a broader conspiracy saga, depending on whether filmmakers choose to expand the mystery or keep tightening the moral screws. In comparison to a director's previous work, if you know their output, Brick often reads as an evolution. Filmmakers who started in intimate dramas will see it as them adding a procedural spine and a taste for formal puzzle-making, while directors known for high-concept sci-fi will view it as a welcome domestication of spectacle. Either way, it's notable for privileging human texture over CGI flourishes. Where genre clichés pop up, archetypal zealots, the charismatic fixer, the sacrificial beat, Brick tends to undercut or invert them by making consequences linger and by letting minor characters behave like real people rather than plot tokens. Musically and aesthetically, it stands apart because recurring motifs, audio blips, Brick textures, monitor imagery, are treated as narrative hooks you can rewatch the film to catch, which isn't always true of its peers. That motif-driven approach rewards repeat viewings in a way that more straightforward thrillers don't. Ultimately, when you measure Brick against the lock-ins, the social experiments, and the single-room anxiety pieces that came before it, what feels new is less a single flashy trick and more a shift in emphasis. Suspense is redistributed from purely external threat to the social mechanics of survival, and that tiny pivot turns a familiar premise into a film that plays fair with genre expectations, while quietly retooling them into something that lingers in conversation. Brick 2025 speaks in objects and patterns more than it screams in plot beats, so its symbolism lives in repetition and small inversions. The brick motif is everywhere, not just the literal matte black skin outside but echoed in wallpaper, a child's toy, a cracked tile, so the material becomes a grammar for the film's argument that protection and imprisonment are two sides of the same masonry. Blinking lights and the three-note audio motif function as both clue and heartbeat, a language the characters learn to read and the audience learns to anticipate, turning sound and sight into the film's secret code that punishes inattention and rewards curiosity. Monitors and mirrors show up as unreliable witnesses. Feeds that promise truth are grainy, delayed, or cropped, which makes watching into a moral act. Do you look? And if you do, what are you allowed to tell? So surveillance is literalized as conscience and weapon at once. Tally marks, ration tins, and a perpetually half-boiling kettle become a ledger of days and debts. A scratched line on a doorframe or a jar labeled in a careful hand accumulates personal history and doubles as a political statement about scarcity, dignity, and what we choose to preserve. Doorways, stairwells and ceiling holes are choreographed metaphors. Thresholds are moral decisions. Stairs map social hierarchy and proximity, and the act of climbing or ducking under a beam reads like a vote for solidarity or selfishness. Small props are loaded, an old photograph, a child's crayon drawing, a misfiled passport, so that when a character handles one it's not exposition but confession. A tremor in the hand says more about character guilt and memory than any monologue could. Light and color are coded. Muted grays flatten the world into pressure, while sudden pops of saturated color, a red scarf, a bright flyer, sting as reminders of life outside and act as visual punctuation for tender or tragic beats. Texture, the scuff of brick, the grit in a kettle, the grain on a wooden spoon, is fetishized so practical effects do narrative work, making touch a language of truth that CGI politely augments. Dust becomes temporal residue, a physical memory of every collision the building has suffered. The true believer's sermon-like cadence is mirrored in recurring chant-like musical underscoring, aligning ideology with sonic rhythm so conviction reads as both comfort and danger, while the escape artist's measuring tools and quick hands are visual metaphors for a certain kind of hubristic faith in numbers and control. Match cuts, reflections in monitors, and foreground occlusions hide or reveal evidence in ways that make editing itself symbolic. The cut that lingers on a brick before snapping to a face asks the viewer to connect object and motive, and the camera's choice to show or withhold becomes an ethical act parallel to the character's choices to speak or stay silent. Even the film's misdirections are symbolic. A toy left in a hallway is first charm, then indictment when it becomes a casualty, teaching that the line between domestic comfort and catastrophe is razor thin. Repetition here is not redundancy but education. The blinking code returns with variations so the audience learns to read its permutations and rewatchings reward pattern spotters. Motifs mutate as characters make compromises, so visual callbacks, a brick, a hum, a particular shadow, register like moral footnotes. The result is a symbolic economy where everyday items are currency, where sound patterns double as prophecy, and where the architecture of the film teaches its themes by construction. Every object, angle and motif is a small moral problem the viewer is invited to decode, not to be handed an answer but to feel how easily the materials of survival can be rearranged into prisons or shelters depending on who holds the story. If Brick 2025 sits inside a franchise, it behaves like the cunning middle chapter of a mystery series rather than a glossy origin blockbuster. It feeds the larger myth with micro-details that expand the world while refusing to hand the map to viewers. Instead of resolving an overarching conspiracy, this film deepens it, dropping modular clues, the blinking code motif, the watcher's network of feeds, references to a failed safety rollout, that work like serialized Easter eggs for repeat viewers while also reframing what earlier entries may have implied. A prequel could show the technology's rollout and the moral compromises of its inventors. A sequel might follow the survivors as inadvertent carriers of that code into a changed city, and a character spin-off could mine the watcher or the true believer's past for fuller ideological context. Tonally, it can recalibrate the franchise's center of gravity. If predecessors were broader in scope, Brick 2025 narrows to the domestic, demonstrating how an expansive conspiracy plays out at street level and giving the series emotional weight by proving the macro is made of microstories. Structurally, the film seeds long arcs, small recurring props, a crusted ration tin, an old photograph, become franchise signifiers, and the ambiguous final reveal, outside is not a haven, functions as a hinge that lets future dramas pivot from containment thriller to road story or global parable. Creatively, it invites a modular franchise strategy. Keep the tactile, low-tech intimacy as a signature aesthetic while scaling the conspiracy outward through different perspectives and locales, thereby preserving a consistent voice, long takes, tactile production design, motif-driven sound, even as the narrative map grows. If Brick 2025 is a later entry in a director's filmography, it reads as either synthesis or detour. Synthesis if it consolidates earlier obsessions, surveillance, human-scale politics, a taste for long, character-driven takes. Detour if it grafts genre machinery onto an auteur's usual formal flourishes. Either way, it can function as a decisive statement about what the filmmaker cares to explore at scale. The director can use serialized motifs to create an auteurial through line across films, turning recurring audio/visual codes into a personal cinematic language that rewards attentive audiences. On the other hand, imagine Brick 2025 pitched as historical drama rather than speculative thriller. Its strengths and compromises shift. Accurate historical films earn trust through archival rigor, costume, dialect, material culture, and believable socio-economic texture, so the production design's fetish for tactile detail, scuffed bricks, labeled jars, tally marks, would be the right instinct to pursue authenticity. Yet historical storytelling also demands choices. Composite characters to compress decades into a digestible arc, dramatized events to create narrative momentum, and sometimes anachronistic framing to make themes resonate with modern viewers. The film would need to balance faithful recreation, period-accurate props, consultation with historians, truthful depiction of institutions and power dynamics, with narrative clarity, resisting the twin dangers of oversimplifying complex causes and using the past merely as a moral foil for the present. Immersion in a historical version of Brick depends on sensory fidelity, soundscape rooted in period noises, lighting reflecting era-specific bulbs and film stocks, and incidental cultural detail that signals lived reality. Yet accuracy alone doesn't guarantee moral or emotional honesty. How the film frames responsibility, who engineered the protection and why, who is centered in the narrative, whose suffering is dramatized, and how much agency is afforded to marginalized voices all determine whether a historical telling feels respectful or exploitative. Whether franchise entry or historical reimagining, the film's recurring motifs, bricks as double-edged metaphors, blinking codes as narrative connective tissue, monitors as testimony, function as canonical glue that can either enrich a larger saga or illuminate a historical moment. In a franchise, they become serialized language that fans decode, and in a historical film, they become symbolic shorthand that helps viewers map past systems of control onto present anxieties. The pragmatic production choice for either path is similar. Keep what worked, practical sets that actors can touch, sound design that makes silence speak, long, actor-driven takes, and decide early whether the film's purpose is to expand a world or interrogate a moment. Franchise storytelling should lean into open threads and modular character vaults, while historical storytelling should invest in verifiable detail, transparent use of dramatization, acknowledging where fiction fills gaps, and ethical framing that resists turning real suffering into mere plot. Either trajectory rewards restraint, don't over-explain the machinery behind the bricks, allow motifs to gather meaning across installments or scenes, and let the human texture, small rituals, shared songs, the politics of rationing, be the connective tissue that makes a series lore or a historical portrait feel lived in rather than schematic, so Brick 2025 can be read as a hinge. It can open a franchise's mythology outward or fold a complex historical episode inward, depending on whether filmmakers want to grow a conspiracy verse or do justice to a real-world analog, and in either case the film's tactile design choices and motif-driven storytelling give creators a reliable toolkit for deepening narrative stakes without flattening the moral questions at its heart. Brick 2025 is a fascinating case where the production quality punches well above what the budget might suggest. You can see careful allocation in every corner, the tactile sets, the meticulous brick textures, the hand-labeled jars, the clever use of long takes and natural lighting all feel expensive and considered, yet the film never relies on flashy CGI or overbuilt spectacle, which is a smart cost-saving measure that doubles as an artistic choice. The budget seems to have been funneled into high-impact areas: production design, prop detail, and rehearsal-intensive sequences that let actors inhabit the spaces fully, which gives the movie a lived-in authenticity that makes viewers forget it isn't a blockbuster-level spend. Visual effects are used sparingly but effectively. A flickering monitor, a subtle lighting shift, or a small practical effect gains maximum narrative weight without draining the wallet. Marketing appears to have leaned on intrigue rather than hype. Cryptic posters featuring blinking motifs, teaser clips emphasizing the claustrophobic tension, and a focus on serialized clues in social media campaigns all contributed to building curiosity and buzz among genre enthusiasts. Audience reception plays a huge role here. Fans of intense, cerebral thrillers spread word of mouth about the small, detail-rich touches, and the conversation about moral ambiguity, social micropolitics, and the puzzle-like tension amplified viewership more than traditional marketing dollars ever could. Box office numbers are interesting because the film's earnings may not reflect blockbuster totals, yet when factoring in marketing efficiency, audience stickiness, and repeat engagement, people rewatching to catch motifs or discuss plot theories, the financial story becomes layered. A modest budget paired with a savvy engagement strategy means per dollar return can feel impressive even if raw gross isn't record-breaking. Internationally, niche markets, thriller aficionados, arthouse viewers, and serialized content fans responded particularly well, often turning specialized screenings or streaming releases into hot topic cultural moments, which indirectly boosts ancillary revenue like digital rentals and merchandise tied to motifs, brick patterns, symbolic props. In essence, the film leverages its budget to emphasize smart, tactile storytelling over spectacle, and the box office picture is a combination of targeted audience enthusiasm, strong production value in visible areas, and the viral power of a story that rewards close attention. So financial performance can't just be read in raw numbers. It must be viewed as the sum of clever allocation, engaged fanbase, and marketing that respects the film's cerebral appeal. Brick 2025 is available for streaming on Netflix, where viewers can watch it in high quality with immersive sound options like Dolby Atmos. The film is accessible in multiple languages, including English, French, German, and Spanish, with subtitles to match, making it easy to experience the story in its original form or with translation. For the fullest impact, it's best to watch the film in its original German language with subtitles, as some nuances may be lost in dubbed versions. A quiet environment and a good sound system help fully appreciate the atmospheric tension, intricate details, and the careful sound design that punctuates key moments. The film is currently not available for digital rental or purchase on other platforms, so Netflix streaming is the primary way to experience it. Watching on a larger screen using devices like smart TVs, Roku, Apple TV, or Chromecast enhances the immersive experience, letting the viewer engage fully with the claustrophobic tension, meticulous set details, and the subtle visual and audio motifs that define the film's style. For audiences who enjoy international thrillers or suspenseful, character-driven narratives, Brick 2025 offers a compelling, fully engaging experience best absorbed in a focused and attentive viewing session. If you enjoyed this video and would like us to provide reviews of every kind of movie, please remember to like, comment, share, and subscribe to our channel. Have a great day, and we'll see you in the next video.
Goodbye.